What's up, everybody? Today back with a new video, and today I just want to do a short little commentary on Plato's Meno. So just 5 to 10 minutes, and we can get into this. Hopefully it'll help you out for those of you who come across this reading in your introductory courses, in whatever if you're just reading it for fun. This short little intro will help you to kind of grasp how the dialogue progresses and give you some jumping points to kind of go off on your own. So let's get into it. The dialogue itself seems to be about three things. So one, virtue; two, knowledge; and three, most often overlooked, the one and the many, or parts and wholes. So in 70a, which is a section in the text, that's how the text is numbered. So in 70a, the question of whether virtue can be taught arises. This is how Meno, the character, starts off the dialogue. And this question is really going to drive the rest of the dialogue. Socrates responds to Meno in his classic fashion, and you can kind of grasp just from his response how he acts in other dialogues. Socrates basically says that you cannot know how to practically reason about something if you do not know what that thing is. In the context of virtue, because Socrates doesn't know what virtue is, he can't answer Meno's question. So, in a sense here, even to ask whether virtue can be taught, as Meno does, requires some knowledge of virtue. And because of this, the dialogue then makes an immediate turn to definitions of virtue. So we see a lot of moves going on right at the beginning. Please go read it on your own. It's a great dialogue. I really love it, but let's continue. So in 71e through 72a, we get Meno talking about his teacher Gorgias, who is a famous sophist. There's actually another Platonic dialogue called the Gorgias, which I also highly recommend that you to read. So in these lines, again, 71e, 72a, Meno is going to give a few definitions of virtue. I'll give you one here and I'll let you figure out the rest on your own. He starts these definitions by asserting that each person has their own virtue based on who they are or what their social role is. He lists men, women, old persons, children, etc. And he says, for instance, that a man's virtue is to be good at politics, while a woman's is to be good at keeping the house. And the obvious rejoinder here by Socrates is that the types of virtue have been listed, but we don't know why they're virtuous or what makes them virtuous. And here we see that crucial interpretive move that I mentioned at the beginning of this dialogue being about parts and wholes, or one and many. So Meno here, you see this very first instance of Meno really struggling to understand the relation between parts and wholes. He understands kind of what instances of so-called virtue are around him, but he doesn't understand how they fit into a unified whole. And again, this is the most important part of the dialogue that's often overlooked, this relationship between how parts and wholes are mediated together. So a classic example, a parallel that you can draw, and I highly suggest when you read philosophy to draw your own examples up. But my own example would be like Meno listing the flavors of Coca-Cola without actually telling Socrates what Coca-Cola actually is. So again, Meno in his first definition, and really the rest of his definitions that he gives, the definitions of virtue, he's listing different virtues, but he's not saying what virtue is. And that would be like me telling you, oh, there's cherry Coke, raspberry Coke, there's Coke Zero, Coke Light, whatever, but not telling you what Coke actually is. So you see how it never gets to that definition of what virtue, or in my case, Coke actually is. Now, this counter that Socrates makes around line 72 forces the dialogue to now turn to what the conditions for a good definition is. And you have to raise the question on your own. What are definitions? How do we formulate them? What would it be like to know about X? I'm filming this on my iPhone. What is the definition of a phone? What is the definition of an iPhone? What's the definition of an iPhone 12 or 13? You see how you can get specified and specified. In another dialogue, the Sophist, we have an opening section that's really all about Plato's theory of definitions. And you can read that as a contrast to Aristotle's theory. Really specific, go look that up on your own. In any case, so far we know, based on Meno's kind of explanation of what virtue is, the failed explanations, that definitions just can't be lists and they just can't be circular. So if you were to ask me what an iPhone is, and I said, oh, well, there's an iPhone 12, 13, iPhone 4, 5, X Pro, Max, whatever, I'd be giving you a list. I wouldn't be giving you a definition. That wouldn't help you know what an iPhone is. So we can't have definitions that are lists. And we also can't have definitions that are circular. So if you ask me what a car is, and I say, oh, well, it's a, I don't know, I use car in the definition. So I don't know, it's a truck. That would be a circular definition because a truck is a car. Another famous example, defining woman in terms of woman. That's been in the news lately. You can go look that up. It's all over the place right now. But the dialogue does not end here. In fact, this is just the beginning. And around line 80D, we get another really famous move in the dialogue, and this is called the learner's paradox. And it's going to run something like this. To learn, you either know something, in which case you don't have to learn it, or you don't know anything, in which case you couldn't inquire into it because you don't know how. So it seems like learning is impossible, at least on a surface level reading. And this causes quite a bit of a stir in the dialogue. And, you can probably think of ways to get around this, but you can reformulate that, and I'm actually going to do that in a later video where I go more in depth into this dialogue. But just think about that for a minute. So think about how when you go to school, you either know something, in which case you don't have to learn it, or you don't know something, in which case you don't know how to inquire into it, and therefore you can't even go about getting started to learn. That's what the paradox is leading at. It's leading at how can you even get started learning? And Socrates in the dialogue here is going to introduce a very, very famous Socratic point, or Socratic idea, Platonic idea you could even say. And that's going to be the theory of recollection. Now, this is super controversial how to interpret this. It's not just, shall we say, it's not just some sort of like innate ideas theory. That's the totally wrong way to go about thinking about this. It's really more complicated than that. And I'll touch on that when I go more in depth in a couple weeks on this dialogue. But what you can do is you can think about it. You can start to think about it like this. We have a problem of how to understand, how to even begin getting knowledge. And Socrates says, oh, well, all of our knowledge is actually in us already, and we in fact recollect or remember. He uses recollect and remember in different senses, but for now you don't have to know about that. We recollect or remember this knowledge from our previous kind of obtaining it, you could say. But even that is a little bit there's a lot of exegetical problems with this section of the dialogue. It's really underdeveloped. But for the most part, you can think about it like this. Basically that we just recollect or remember knowledge, and that is how we come to know it. So all knowledge is already in the soul, and we just have to recollect it through a good teacher bringing it out of us. And Socrates spells this out with this really famous example of the slave boy. And you have a slave boy who comes and does mathematics with Socrates in the sand. And Socrates, only by questioning him, draws out of his soul knowledge that he supposedly already had in the soul. And so the whole theory of recollection is getting this idea that we have this knowledge in our soul, and it's drawn out through a teacher, purportedly to be someone like Socrates. So in any case, it gets a lot more complicated than that, at least that theory, and what this whole idea of recollection is, and how to solve it, what exactly is the function in Plato's own corpus of works, can it be defended today? That's a whole scholarly project. But in any case, that is enough for you to know if you're just getting introduced to the text. Now, near the end of the dialogue, Plato brings in this other guy named Anytus, who you can read, and you should read, as a contrast, a direct contrast to Meno. So Meno, throughout the text, really struggles to understand, as I stated before, the distinction between parts and wholes and how they mediate together. And this is really one of these central ideas of philosophy. It's called the problem of the one and the many. And Anytus comes in because he is the opposite of Meno. Meno is obsessed with parts, and he can't understand the coherent whole. Anytus is obsessed with the whole, and he can't understand how parts fit in. And so what the dialogue is getting at here is that without a proper understanding of parts and wholes and how they work together and are unified, you can't do philosophy, and you end up in one of these extremes. The extreme of Meno, who is just this kind of ignorant guy who makes a fool out of himself by failing to understand what questions to ask and failing to understand how the dialogue works, and Anytus, who comes off as this pompous, arrogant guy who also doesn't know what he's talking about. And so Plato really wants you to understand how wholes and parts work together. And I think that you can start to see this in your own life if you pay attention. Oftentimes you'll hear people try to argue, especially in politics, especially in your friend groups. People will try to argue based on their own anecdotal experiences and then come to a universal conclusion. That is in fact making the same exact error that Meno is making. And other times you'll hear people make hasty generalizations or basically stereotyping some sort of group, stuff like that. I'm trying to think of another example. Something like, you could even say in your education, this is an example I've used before, not understanding the parts of the education and how they fit into a coherent structure. That would be the sort of error that Anytus is making. And so a great thing to think about is your own college education here. Are your classes structured to lead to some coherent whole? Is there a sort of unitive glue that holds them together? Is there some sort of theme that runs through all of your classes? For instance, the theme of knowledge as being your final end, as knowledge being worthwhile in itself. Is that underlying your classes? Or are your classes just kind of like mishmashed together and not really allowing you to make sense of what learning is, not really allowing you to make sense of why you're at college in the first place? That would be the exact kind of error. That would be a sort of whole to part error where you don't understand the whole. That would be the error that Meno would make. Anytus's error of not understanding the parts is a bit less common, I think. But in any case, read the dialogue, think about that, keep in mind how parts and wholes are related in the dialogue, because that's going to be, again, a major key theme here. And finally, I want to draw attention to another extremely important distinction made around lines 97 and 98, and that's going to be the distinction between true opinion and knowledge, or correct, proper knowledge. So we draw this distinction a lot. And this is the distinction between having just a true opinion about something and having actual knowledge or legitimate knowledge about something. So for instance, the text uses the example of a route to get somewhere. So somebody could mistakenly tell you the proper way to get from destination A to B. And that could work fine. It'll always get you there if it's always the proper or the true opinion, even though the person is mistaken somehow, then it will always get you there and it'll function fine. So this is something that you should kind of actually think about. And the best example that I used is, I think, a sports coach. So imagine a sports coach gives you some weird tips that you don't think will help, but it improves your technique. So for instance, you're playing hockey, baseball, golf, football, and the coach says something, kind of esoteric, like hold the ball or hold the stick like you're holding a baby bird. And for some reason, it just helps your technique and allows you to succeed in the sport. That would be true opinion, because the coach doesn't know really what he's talking about, and he doesn't have a knowledge of why that tip will help you to perform better. And Plato makes the crucial distinction here between having true opinion and having true knowledge. And the distinction between the two, the reason why they're different, is having sufficient knowledge of causes. And so it's really in understanding the causes behind things that leads one to having knowledge. You could think of, I have a car sitting out there. You could think of this, working on your car, as another example. And so say, for instance, and my friend has actually done this before, your check engine light goes on, and you go around and you just kind of take a wrench and you hit the engine a couple times. And what do you know? The car is fixed. You could say to somebody, oh, I fixed my car. And Plato would say, okay, that's true in the opinionative sense, meaning that you fixed your car, yes, but you didn't really have knowledge of how to fix your car. And that knowledge is going to come from you actually knowing how the engine works and the causes behind the problem of the car and the causes of how to fix it. So I think that's a useful distinction to make in your own life. It is very helpful. I'm trying to think of other examples. You can think of them all the time. Electricity. There are lights outside. if the light is broken and you kind of like reset the electricity in your house or something and it turns back on, can you really say that you know how to fix the lights? Well, of course not. You have opinion that just happened to be true about how to fix the lights, but you don't have knowledge of the cause of how to fix the lights, the proper understanding of the framework of the electrician does. So that is going to be the last kind of main point of the Meno. As you can tell, there's just a ton going on in this dialogue. It's only like 40 pages or so, but there's just a lot going on. So there's discussion of virtue, discussion of parts and wholes / one and many, discussion of knowledge and opinion. What else have I mentioned so far? The theory of recollection. There's a lot of stuff that's really literary, kind of cool to read. So again, I recommend that you go read this. I think you'll have a great time. And I hope that you can sit, think about it, and it'll impact your own philosophical journey. So thanks for watching. Make sure you like, subscribe, and feel free to comment.